Good evening, and welcome back. I want to thank everyone who wrote in after the last episode. And yes, I saw where some of you are listening from, which always does something to me, knowing this goes out into rooms I'll never see, kitchens, cars, somebody's headphones on a night shift somewhere. Tonight is a different kind of story. We've spent a lot of time in halls of marble and thunder, with kings who throw lightning and queens who never forgive. Tonight, we go somewhere older than that, and somewhere a great deal more contested, because almost nothing about tonight's subject is agreed upon. Get comfortable, settle in. Tonight, Lilith, the first demon queen, if that's even the right word for her. We'll get to that. Before there was a garden, before there was a rib taken in the night, there was a question nobody wanted to answer cleanly. Who was made first? And what does first even mean when the maker himself is still figuring out the shape of things? Some traditions say there were two acts of creation, not one. The first act, formless and almost forgotten, made a being from the same red clay as the man who would come after, equal, identical in substance, breathed into with the same breath. Her name meant night or storm wind or screech owl, depending on which old tongue you trust, and none of them quite agree, which feels, I don't know, fitting somehow for someone whose whole story is a disagreement. Lilith. She did not crawl up from some pit. That's important. And people forget it, or they never knew it. Because by the time her story reaches most ears, it's already been flattened into something simpler. A monster, a seductress, a cautionary tale whispered to frighten children at bedtime. But in the oldest tellings, she begins as an equal. Same dust, same breath, same garden. And that single fact, is the hinge the entire myth turns on. Picture the garden before names had settled onto things. The rivers hadn't been numbered yet. The animals wandered without titles, the way a child moves through a house before they've learned which rooms belong to which parent. And in this place, two beings made of the same earth opened their eyes at more or less the same moment. The man's name would become Adam, ground, earth, the stuff beneath your feet given a voice. Hers became Lilith, and here the etymologies start arguing with each other, the way they always do with her. Some scholars trace it to a Sumerian word for a wind spirit, a creature of storms and empty places. Others connect it to the Akkadian Lilitu, demons of the night who haunted the thresholds between sleeping and waking. Still others insist it's simply a feminine form of Layla, night itself, in Hebrew. Night, storm, threshold. Already, before she's done a single thing, her name is doing 3 jobs at once, and none of them are obedient. So there, the two of them, man and the one who would become Lilith, stood in the garden as equals. No hierarchy yet, no one above, no one beneath. They had been made the same way, from the same substance, and this matters enormously to later interpreters, the same time. Not one first and one second, not one from the body of the other, side by side, like two halves of a single thought the Creator had, simultaneously, the way you might write 2 words on a page at once if your hand could move that fast. For a while, and we don't know how long a while was, because time itself was still new and hadn't learned to march in one direction yet. This seemed to work. They walked the garden. They named things together, or near each other anyway. The world was green and astonishing, and entirely without precedent, and there was no one to tell them what any of it meant. So they had to decide for themselves, which is either the most frightening thing in the world or the most free. And maybe it's both, and maybe that's the whole point. But equality, it turns out, is easy to declare and very hard to live inside of. The trouble, if trouble is even the word, and I keep going back and forth on whether it is, began with something almost embarrassingly small, a position, just a position. The man wanted to lie above her when they came together, the way the sky god of an older, half-forgotten cosmology had once pressed down upon the earth, on top, dominant, the shape of the heavens bearing down on the shape of the ground. It was, to him, simply how things were arranged, the natural order as he understood it, which is to say, the order that happened to favor him. Lilith refused. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's easy to read past it. She refused, not out of malice, not out of some demonic impulse planted in her from birth. There was no from birth distinction yet. Remember, they were identical in origin. She refused because she could not understand why one of them should be beneath the other when they had been made, dust for dust, breath for breath, in the same instant. Why should I lie beneath you? She is said to have asked. When we are equal, both of us made from earth. It's such a simple question. It's the kind of question a child asks that makes the adults in the room go quiet. Adam, and I picture him here, not as a villain, not yet, just as someone repeating what he believed without ever having been asked to defend it, answered with what he thought was obvious. He should be on top because he should be on top, because that's how it's done. Because, and this is the part that should sound familiar to absolutely everyone listening in any century, because that's just the natural order of things. She didn't accept it, and I think this is where I have to be honest with you. There are versions of this story, later versions, Christian and folkloric retellings written centuries after the fact, that paint this refusal as the first sin, pride, rebellion, the seed of all demonic corruption sprouting from one woman's unwillingness to lie still. I'm not going to pretend those versions don't exist, because they shaped how most of the Western world came to understand her. But the oldest texts, the ones closest to wherever this story actually began, they don't frame it that way. They frame it as a disagreement between equals that one of the two equals refused to lose. Anyway, the argument escalated. Arguments about fundamentals always do. You start by disagreeing about where someone should lie down, and somehow, within an hour, you're disagreeing about the entire architecture of existence. Who deserves what? Who came from whom? Who owes whom anything at all? Adam, the story goes, tried to force the issue. Lilith, finding herself suddenly the weaker party in a conflict that had begun as a conversation between equals, did the only thing available to someone who refuses to be subordinated and cannot win by strength. She spoke a name, not just any name, the name, the ineffable one, the one so sacred it was never to be spoken aloud, the one whose utterance was said to carry power that bypassed every ordinary law of the world, the way a key bypasses a locked door simply by fitting it. We don't know how she knew it. The texts don't explain this, and I've always found that strange, that the single most consequential piece of information in the entire story, how a being made from clay only hours or days into existence came to possess the most forbidden word in creation is simply never addressed. It's just there. She knew it. She used it. And when she spoke it, she rose into the air, not flew exactly. The old descriptions are careful about this. It wasn't flight so much as departure, the way smoke leaves a room not by traveling so much as by simply ceasing to be contained. And she left the garden. She left. I keep coming back to that word because every retelling I've ever encountered wants to make it about something else. Punishment, expulsion, banishment, the language of someone being thrown out. But in the earliest tellings, nobody throws her anywhere. She speaks the name, and she goes, under her own power, toward, and this is the detail that always gets me, toward the Red Sea. Why the Red Sea? I genuinely don't know, and I'll admit that to you now, rather than pretend otherwise. Some say it's simply because it represented the edge of the known world to the people first telling this story, the farthest place imaginable, a kind of geographical, the end of the map, here be monsters. Except the monster, in this case, was the one doing the traveling, not the one waiting at the destination. Others connect it to later associations between Lilith and the sea demons of older Mesopotamian tradition, creatures of salt water and storm. I don't have a satisfying answer. I've kept the detail anyway because it feels significant somehow, even if I can't tell you why. Maybe you'll have a theory. Write in. What we do know is what happened next, because this part of the story, unlike almost everything else about her, is told with remarkable consistency across multiple sources, which in mythology is itself a kind of miracle. Adam complained. He went, in some versions immediately, in others after a period of loneliness that the texts pass over in a sentence or two, as though it weren't worth dwelling on, to the Creator. And he said, in essence, the woman has left me, and I am alone. And this is not what was promised. Whether this was framed as a complaint about loneliness or a complaint about insubordination depends entirely on which text you're reading and which century it was written in. And I think that tells you almost everything you need to know about how this story has been used over the millennia. Loneliness is sympathetic. Insubordination requires correction. The Creator, in any case, dispatched 3 angels to retrieve her. Their names are given as Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangelof. And I'll be honest, the first time I encountered these names, I had to read them 4 or 5 times before they stopped looking like typos of each other, which maybe says something about how this story treats its supporting cast. They are barely characters at all. They are functionaries, messengers sent to do a job. And the job was this: find her and bring her back, or, failing that, extract a promise. They found her at the Red Sea. What they found her doing is where the story stops being about a marital dispute and becomes something else entirely, something that would echo through nursery folklore for thousands of years afterward, whispered by mothers and grandmothers in dozens of languages, in rooms where infants slept and amulets hung from cradle strings. She had not been idle. In the time since she left the garden, Lilith had, and the texts are matter of fact about this in a way that almost undersells how strange it is, begun to give birth, constantly, continuously, not to children in any ordinary sense, but to demons, hundreds of them, by some counts thousands, a ceaseless generative outpouring that some later commentators would describe almost like a wound that wouldn't close, a fertility turned inside out, producing not life in the way the garden had intended, but something adjacent to it, something that walked and breathed and screamed but was not quite what either of the first two beings had been. The angels delivered their message: return or face a consequence. The consequence, as they explained it, was specific and grim. 100 of her demon children would die every single day for as long as she refused to come back. She refused. I want to slow down here, because I think this is the moment that determines everything about how you read the rest of her story, and different traditions have read it in wildly different ways. One reading: this is the moment Lilith becomes a villain, a mother who would rather watch her children die in their hundreds than submit to a husband's authority. Proof to those who wanted proof of an inhuman coldness at her core. Another reading, and I'll admit this is the one I find harder to shake once you've sat with it. This is the moment Lilith becomes something closer to tragic, a being faced with an impossible choice, framed by her former companion's allies as a choice between freedom and motherhood, when in any just accounting, it should never have had to be a choice at all. The angels, having delivered their ultimatum and received their refusal, did not drag her back by force. And this too is worth noting, because it would have been so easy for the story to go that way, and it doesn't. Instead, they extracted something smaller, a concession, not a surrender. She would not return to the garden. That much was settled, and settled permanently. There is no version of this story, however late or however hostile to her, in which Lilith goes back to Eden. But she made them a promise, or perhaps it's more accurate to say she accepted a constraint. Wherever the names of these three angels, Sinoi, Sansanoi, Samangalov, were displayed, written, spoken, hung above a doorway or inscribed on an amulet, she would not enter. She would not harm the children within. This is, when you think about it, an extraordinarily small piece of magic to extract from a being who had just spoken the unspeakable name of God and risen bodily from the earth under her own power. 3 names on a piece of parchment. And yet, for thousands of years afterward, genuinely into the modern era, there are accounts of amulets bearing these 3 names hung in birthing rooms across the Middle East and parts of Europe well into living memory. This was considered sufficient. 3 names written down kept her at bay. I don't know what to make of that, honestly. Part of me wants to call it a kind of cosmic loophole, a technicality, the sort of thing that feels almost funny if you squint at it sideways. The most ancient and feared figure in this entire mythology, held back by what amounts to a name tag on the door. But another part of me, and this is the part that's harder to articulate, wonders if that's exactly the point. That the protection was never really about Lilith at all. That it was about giving frightened parents something to do with their hands in the dark hours of the night. Some small ritual against a fear too large to otherwise hold. I need to pause here for a second, actually. Not because the story is getting harder to follow, but because I realize I've been telling this as though it's one continuous narrative, handed down whole. And that's not really true. What I've just described, the equal creation, the dispute, the name, the flight, the angels, the bargain, comes primarily from a single text, a medieval one, far later than the biblical material it claims to be commenting on. Most of what most people know about Lilith, the idea that she was Adam's first wife at all, doesn't appear explicitly in the older scriptural texts in the form we'd recognize. It's an interpretation built up over centuries, stitched together from a couple of stray verses, an alternate creation account that seems to describe two simultaneous creations rather than one sequential one, and a single, solitary, almost throwaway mention of a creature called Lilith in a much older prophetic text, a list of desert-dwelling creatures, satyrs and night creatures and screech owls, haunting the ruins of a fallen city. That's it. That's the entire scriptural foundation. One word in one list, in one prophecy about ruins. Everything else, the garden, the equality, the refusal, the demons, the bargain at the Red Sea, is commentary, interpretation, centuries of rabbis and mystics and folklorists looking at that single word in that single list and asking, who was this? Where did she come from? And building, brick by brick, an entire biography for a figure who appears in the actual ancient text for less time than it takes to read this sentence, which, and I think this might be the most important thing I say tonight, doesn't make her any less real in the way that matters for a story like this. If anything, it makes her more interesting, because it means Lilith isn't really a character who was written once and then passed down. She's a character who was built slowly by generation after generation of people who looked at the gaps in their own scriptures, the unanswered questions, the loose threads, the places where the official story didn't quite explain everything, and filled those gaps with her. She is, in a very real sense, made of absence of the things the original story didn't say, and that feels appropriate for someone whose name has meant night and storm, and the space at the threshold where one thing becomes another. Okay, let me collect the thread, because there's a lot more ground to cover, and I don't want to lose the shape of where we're going. We've established the foundation, equal creation, the dispute, the flight, the bargain at the sea. What I want to do next is follow two threads outward from that foundation, because they split apart pretty quickly and don't come back together for a long, long time. The first thread is what happened to Lilith herself, where she went, what she became, how the stories about her grew and twisted across the centuries through Mesopotamian night demons and medieval Jewish mysticism and Renaissance grimoires, and all the way into modern reclamation movements that look at this exact story I just told you and read it completely differently. The second thread is what happened back in the garden, because Adam didn't stay alone, obviously, and the woman who came after, the one made from his rib rather than from the same clay at the same moment, would carry the shadow of Lilith with her for the rest of her own story, in the ways that the texts hint at, but rarely state outright. Both of these threads matter, but I think, and tell me if you disagree, write in, I read these. I think the first thread is the bigger one, the one with more turns in it. So that's where we're headed first, into the dark, into what Lilith became once she was, finally, completely, on her own. So picture her at the shore. The angels have gone, back up, back to wherever angels go when their errand is finished, which the texts never describe. Another gap, another absence, and Lilith remains alone beside a sea that would later carry her name in folk etymologies nobody can quite verify, surrounded by a generation of children who are dying 100 a day because of the choice she made. What does a being do with that? The old stories don't dwell on grief here, and I think that's worth noting, because it would have been so easy to dwell on it. There's no scene of mourning, no lament sung over the bodies of the lost. Instead, and this is where the narrative starts to pick up speed, almost uncomfortably, she turns outward, toward the world that had just been built without her, toward the garden she'd left and the man still walking inside it, and eventually toward the woman who would come to occupy the place that had once been hers. But before any of that, before Eve, before the serpent, before any of the parts of this story that most people think they already know, there's a long stretch of time that the texts handle almost in passing, a kind of fast forward through centuries, where Lilith does what the night demons of older Mesopotamian religion had always done. She haunts. This is where the threads start to braid together, the ones I mentioned. Because by the time Jewish mystical tradition had finished building its version of Lilith, it had absorbed, almost wholesale, an entire pre-existing category of demon from the cultures that had come before. The Babylonians and Sumerians had their Lilitu, female night spirits, associated with storms, with desolate places, with the thresholds of houses and the edges of sleep. There were male counterparts too, and a whole taxonomy of related beings. But it was the Lilitu that survived longest in folk memory, because it was the Lilitu that mothers feared. These spirits were said to slip into houses at night, not through doors particularly. Doors weren't the point. They came through whatever gap existed, a crack in the wall, an open window, the space beneath a door where the night air gets in. And they came for two things: sleeping men whose dreams they would enter in ways the older texts describe only obliquely, harvesting something from those dreams to fuel the endless production of more of their own kind. And infants, newborns, especially in the first days of life, before they had names, before they had been formally welcomed into the human world by whatever rite a given culture used to mark that welcome. I find this detail, the targeting of the unnamed, almost unbearably sad, honestly, and I don't think I'm alone in that, because it's exactly the kind of detail that gets repeated century after century, culture after culture, in slightly different forms, as though it's touching something that doesn't go away just because the names of the gods change. A child who hasn't been named yet is a child who is, in some sense, still between worlds, not fully arrived, not fully claimed, not fully protected by whatever social and spiritual machinery exists to protect the already named. And it's precisely in that gap, that threshold state, that the night demon was said to reach. Lilith, in the form she took on after the Red Sea, became, by absorption, by accumulation, by centuries of storytellers reaching for an existing category and a new name to attach it to, the queen of exactly these creatures, not just one demon among many, but the source of them, the mother of them, in the most literal sense the text could manage. Every demon she had birthed in that frenzy by the sea, and every demon birthed afterward by her or in her image, or simply in emulation of her, became part of a kind of court, a dark mirror of the heavenly host, with Lilith, eventually, at his head. I want to be careful here, though, because Queen is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and the texts themselves are not consistent about what kind of queen she was, or queen of what exactly, or whether queen even existed as a meaningful category in whatever realm these demons occupied. Some later mystical traditions describe an entire infernal hierarchy, mirroring the celestial one with uncomfortable precision. Princes and princesses, courts and consorts, a whole bureaucracy of darkness that honestly starts to feel, the more you read about it, less like a vision of cosmic horror and more like, and I say this with real affection, an org chart. Somebody, somewhere, sat down and decided that even hell needed middle management. Anyway, at the head of this hierarchy, in many of these later texts, Lilith is paired with a consort, a figure sometimes described as the angel of death, sometimes as something closer to a fallen power in his own right. The texts disagree, as they disagree about almost everything in this story. Some traditions describe this pairing as a kind of dark counterpart to the divine couple, a shadow marriage that mirrored, mockingly or tragically, depending on the telling, the union that Lilith herself had refused back in the garden, as though, having rejected one kind of partnership on the grounds of inequality, she found herself, generations later, in another kind of partnership entirely, on terms the texts never quite spell out. I don't know what to do with that parallel. I've sat with it for a while, and I keep going back and forth. Is it ironic? Is it tragic? Is it just the inevitable shape these stories take? Because the people telling them couldn't conceive of a powerful female figure existing without some kind of male counterpart eventually being slotted in beside her, even in hell, even after everything. I genuinely don't have an answer. I've left the detail in because it felt important to mention, even though I can't tell you with any confidence what it's important for. What I can tell you is what came next, because this is the part of the story that loops back. The part where the second thread, the one about Eve, finally rejoins the first. Adam, alone in the garden after Lilith's departure, was given a second companion. This time, the creation was different, not simultaneous, not from the same handful of earth, but derivative, taken from Adam's own body while he slept, shaped from a rib or, in some readings, from his side more broadly, a piece of him reshaped into someone else. The second woman does not refuse her place. She does not speak any forbidden name. She does not rise from the garden under her own power. But the serpent, I think almost everyone who's grown up anywhere near these traditions knows some version of the scene. The garden, the tree, the offered fruit, a voice in the branches promising knowledge in exchange for a single broken instruction. What far fewer people know is that in some of the later traditions, and I want to stress later, because this isn't in the oldest layers, this is centuries of accumulated commentary doing what it always does, filling gaps. The serpent isn't just a serpent. It's Lilith. Or it's ridden by Lilith. Or it's animated by her, possessed by her, used as a vessel by a being who, having been denied entry to the garden by name and by angel and by bargain, found one final way back in, not as herself, not in any form that could be recognized, and turned away at the door, but as something low to the ground, something easy to overlook, something that had always been part of the garden's furniture, and so attracted no suspicion at all. If this is true, and again, true is doing a strange amount of work in a sentence about a myth, but you know what I mean, then the entire fall of humanity, the whole catastrophic unraveling that, in these traditions, explains why the world is full of suffering and labor and death in the first place, traces back to Lilith, not as a demon attacking from outside, but as the spurned first wife returning in disguise, offering the second wife the very thing, the very specific thing that had caused the entire rift in the first place. Knowledge, the ability to know things, to question things, to ask the way Lilith herself had once asked, why should it be this way when it could be another way? I keep turning this over and I keep landing in the same place, which is whether or not you believe a single word of any of this as history, as theology, as anything other than story. The symmetry is extraordinary. The first woman departs after asking a question about equality. The second woman is offered the capacity to ask questions at all. And if the serpent carries Lilith's intention, then the same figure is present at both ruptures, not causing the same rift twice, but offering twice in two different forms to two different women the same essential gift, the capacity to want something other than what you've been told to want. That's not nothing. I think that might be the whole story actually, compressed into two scenes a few chapters apart. The second woman, of course, pays for it. They both do, the man too. The garden closes. The world outside becomes a place of thorns and labor and pain, which is its own grim echo of Lilith's punishment, isn't it? The 100 dying children a day, motherhood itself becoming a site of suffering in both stories, just distributed differently. Lilith's children died because she chose freedom. The second woman's children would be born in pain because she chose knowledge. Neither woman, in the end, gets to have both. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's the architecture of the thing. But I also think, and this is where I have to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you, different readers across thousands of years have looked at that architecture and seen completely different buildings. Some have seen a warning. This is what happens when women want things. Others, especially in more recent centuries, have looked at the exact same architecture and seen something closer to an indictment, not of the women, but of a story that could only imagine female desire, female autonomy, female curiosity, as the hinge on which catastrophe turns. We'll come back to that second reading later, because it matters a great deal for how Lilith gets used, reclaimed really, in the modern world. But first, there's a lot of history to get through, centuries of it, because once Lilith exists as a category, queen of demons, mother of the night spirits, consort of a dark power, possible serpent in the garden, she doesn't stay still. She accumulates. Every culture that encounters the idea of a dangerous female night spirit, and there are a lot of them, starts to fold its own local fears into her shape, the way a snowball picks up everything it rolls over. Let's go through some of those. The Babylonian and Sumerian night spirits I've already mentioned, but there's a related figure worth naming separately, a much older demoness, predating the Lilith stories by a very long time, blamed specifically and almost exclusively for infant mortality and for complications in childbirth. She wasn't folded into Lilith by name exactly. Different figure, different origin, different rituals built up around warding her off. But by the time later, traditions were assembling the composite figure of Lilith as demon queen, this older demoness's specific portfolio, infant death, maternal danger, the predatory presence at the bedside of the newly delivered, got absorbed into Lilith's as well, almost as though the stories themselves recognized that these fears belong together, regardless of which ancient name had originally carried them. This is a pattern, by the way. I want to name it explicitly because it's going to recur. Figures get absorbed. Lilith doesn't stay one thing. She becomes a kind of attractor, a name that other, older, more localized fears get pulled toward and folded into, until the Lilith of, say, 16th century Eastern European folk magic bears only a loose family resemblance to the Lilith of the texts I described earlier. Same name, vastly expanded job description. There's another figure worth setting beside her here, even though the connection between them is more thematic than historical. A queen of the underworld in an entirely different mythological tradition, one we touched on weeks ago, who divides her year between the world above and the world below, and whose movements determine the seasons. I'm not claiming any direct link between these two figures. The textual histories don't really support that, and I don't want to manufacture a connection that isn't there, but I find it useful to hold them side by side for a moment, because they represent two very different answers to roughly the same underlying anxiety. What happens to the feminine when it's associated with the underworld, with the realm beneath, with the parts of existence that the daylight world would rather not look at directly? In the seasonal queen story, the answer is cyclical. She goes below. The world grieves and goes cold. She returns. The world warms again. There's a rhythm to it, a predictability, and crucially, there's a mother above, grieving, whose grief is itself part of the mechanism. The world's coldness isn't punishment, it's mourning, a mourning that ends every year on schedule. Lilith doesn't get a cycle. There's no scheduled return, no mother grieving on the surface waiting for her to come back, no yearly thaw. Her time below is, and I keep using this word, and I think it's the right one, open-ended. Whatever has gone below, in her case, whatever has been pushed to the margins, doesn't come back on a schedule. It either stays gone, or it gets summoned back specifically by Ben Sira, by Solomon, by whoever needs to negotiate with her for a particular reason, and then sent below again, the boundary redrawn, the door closed, until the next time someone needs something from her. I think that difference says something about how these two traditions imagine the underworld itself, honestly. One tradition could imagine the underworld as part of a cycle, necessary, even nourishing, in its own dark way, the place the seeds go before they sprout. The other tradition, the one Lilith belongs to, seems to imagine the underworld as something closer to a permanent overflow space, the place where things go that don't fit anywhere else and that aren't expected to come back, except as exceptions, as special cases, as the demon Solomon happens to need to ask a question of this one time. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's only about gender either, though gender is clearly part of it in both cases. Both figures are women associated with realms beneath the visible world, and the rules governing their movement between worlds say a great deal about how each tradition imagined feminine power more broadly. But I think it's also about what each tradition was trying to explain. The seasonal queen story is explaining something that happens every single year, reliably, observably. The seasons turn back. This needs an explanation that itself turns and turns back. Lilith's story isn't explaining something cyclical. It's explaining something that, from the perspective of the people telling it, simply shouldn't happen at all. Infants who shouldn't die, dying. Dreams that shouldn't be shameful, feeling shameful. A world that was supposed to be good, containing suffering anyway. Those aren't cyclical problems, they're ruptures. And a story explaining a rupture doesn't need a cycle. It needs a culprit and a boundary and a way of saying, this happened once, at the very beginning, and the consequences of it are still leaking through, here and there, whenever the boundary gets thin. Let me tell you about one more named episode before we move toward the end of tonight, because I think it illustrates something about how these later traditions handled Lilith that none of the earlier episodes quite capture. And this one involves, of all things, a wedding in certain folk traditions. And again, the dating here is genuinely uncertain. The kind of story that probably circulated in oral form for a long time before anyone wrote it down, which means the written version we have access to might be centuries younger than the story itself. There's an account of a young bridegroom who, on the night before his wedding, takes a walk alone, the way nervous bridegrooms apparently do in stories from a lot of different cultures, needing air, needing space, needing the moment before the thing that's about to change his life actually happens. In the course of this walk, he encounters a woman, beautiful, alone, somehow exactly where he happens to be walking, which should probably have been his first clue, though of course it never is in stories like this. They talk. In some versions, he doesn't recognize her at all. In others, there's a flicker of unease he can't quite place, a sense that something about her doesn't add up, though he can't say what. Words are exchanged, and in at least one version of this story, the words exchanged amount, almost accidentally, to a kind of vow. Not a formal one, not anything either of them would have called a wedding, but something said, in passing, in the dark, that the story treats as binding anyway, because that's how this tradition handles vows generally. The idea that words spoken with sufficient sincerity, regardless of context or intention, carry weight in the world, whether or not the speaker meant them to. The young man returns home. The actual wedding happens the next day, as planned, except that something is wrong. The bride he's marrying isn't the only one who considers herself married to him now. And the woman from the night before, Lilith, in this telling, though the story is coy for a long time about confirming it directly, doesn't simply disappear because a more official ceremony has now taken place. She has a claim, a small one, a strange one, based on words exchanged in the dark that nobody else witnessed and that the bridegroom himself can barely remember clearly the next morning. But a claim nonetheless, and the rest of the story is essentially about what it takes to dissolve a claim like that. Rituals, negotiations, the same three angelic names again in some versions, though here they're not protecting a cradle. They're undoing a marriage that was never supposed to have happened in the first place, a marriage made of nothing but words spoken to the wrong person at the wrong time. I find this story fascinating for a reason that's a little oblique, so bear with me. Almost every other story about Lilith that we've covered tonight involves her either refusing a bond, the original refusal in the garden, or being barred from one, the amulets, the protective names, the boundary that keeps her out of the birthing room. This story is different. In this story, she's not refusing connection or being excluded from it. She's claiming one, a connection nobody else intended, based on a technicality, a loophole in how vows work. And the entire resolution of the story involves other people working very hard to argue that the connection doesn't count, actually, that it shouldn't be binding, that there's a difference between words spoken carelessly and words spoken with full understanding of their weight. And I keep thinking, what if this story isn't really about marriage at all, or not only about marriage? What if it's about the same underlying anxiety that runs through the entire mythology? The anxiety that words have power independent of intention, that the universe doesn't actually care whether you meant what you said, that meaning well isn't a defense against having spoken a binding word in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the same anxiety, isn't it, that sits underneath the original name-speaking in the garden. Lilith spoke a word, and the word worked, regardless of anyone's intentions about how or when or by whom that word was supposed to be used. Words, in this entire mythological framework, aren't symbols that point at things. They're closer to mechanisms, levers. And once you understand that words work mechanically, independent of intention, then a careless vow spoken to a stranger in the dark isn't a small thing at all. It's a lever that's been pulled, whether or not the person pulling it understood what the lever was connected to. I don't have a tidy way to close this thought, so I'm just going to leave it there and move on, the way the story itself sort of does. The bridegroom's claim gets resolved eventually, through ritual, through the same kinds of negotiated boundaries we've seen everywhere else tonight, and the wedding proceeds, and life goes on, and nobody, as far as the story tells us, ever quite explains to the bride what almost happened the night before her own wedding, which feels like its own kind of small, quiet tragedy, tucked into the corner of a story that's ostensibly a folk tale with a happy ending. Anyway, actually, no. I already used that word as a hard pivot earlier tonight, and I don't want to lean on it twice. Let me try this differently. Not just a demon, but an embodiment of a particular kind of imbalance, a feminine divine presence severed from its proper place, wandering, hungry, dangerous precisely because it had been cut off from where it belonged. Some texts describe a kind of cosmic drama playing out on a scale far larger than one garden or one marriage, a fracture in the structure of divinity itself, with Lilith as one symptom, one expression of something having gone wrong at the very foundations of how the world was put together. I find this version both more abstract and, oddly, more sympathetic than the earlier ones, even though it's also the version that gets used in some of these same traditions to justify the most extreme protective rituals, amulets, incantations, elaborate systems of warding meant to keep this cosmic disturbance away from vulnerable households. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The more cosmically significant Lilith becomes, the more the actual lived response to her shrinks down to the domestic scale. A piece of parchment over a cradle, 3 names written in a specific order, a particular phrase spoken at a particular moment during childbirth, the vast and the tiny sitting right next to each other. I don't think that's unique to this story. Actually, I think that's just what fear does when it gets old enough. It becomes cosmic in its explanations and microscopic in its remedies. There's also, in some of these traditions, a thread about eventual repair. The idea that Lilith's exile isn't necessarily permanent, that there's a future moment, a kind of cosmic correction in which the fracture gets healed and whatever Lilith represents gets reintegrated into the proper order of things. I mention this not because it's a major thread. It isn't in most versions, but because it's one of the few places in the entire body of Lilith lore where her story is allowed to end somewhere other than exile, danger, or destruction. Almost everywhere else, across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, Lilith's story is a story without a resolution. She's always still out there, still at the threshold, still the thing the amulet is meant to keep on the other side of the door. Which brings me, I think, to a question I've been circling for a while now, without quite landing on it. What is Lilith, structurally, within this whole sprawling mythology? Not who. We've covered who, more or less, as much as anyone can. But what role does she play, mechanically, in the stories that keep needing her? And I think the answer is she's the explanation for things that otherwise have no explanation. Why do infants sometimes die for no apparent reason? Lilith. Why do men sometimes have dreams they're ashamed of? Lilith. Why does the world contain suffering at all when the official story says it was made good? Lilith. In the garden, in disguise, offering the wrong gift to the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. She is, in this sense, less a character than a kind of narrative pressure release valve, a place where all the unexplained badness in the world can be routed, given a face, given a name, and crucially, given a set of rituals that let frightened people feel like they're doing something about it. That's a heavy job for one figure to carry across 3,000 years. And I think, though I'll admit this is more my own reading than something I can point to in a specific text, I think it's worth asking what that job does to the figure carrying it. What does it do to a character over centuries to be the place where an entire civilization puts its fear of the dark? I don't think it makes her evil exactly. I think it makes her overloaded, crowded, a figure with so many different fears stacked on top of her original story that the original story, the equal creation, the simple, almost reasonable refusal to lie beneath someone she'd been made alongside, gets buried under everything that came after, which is, in a strange way, exactly what happened to her in the garden too. Buried under what came after, replaced, written over. There's a kind of recursion in that, isn't there? The way her story keeps repeating its own shape, even in how it gets told. I'm not sure I can explain that better than I just did. So I'm going to leave it there and move on, because there's a whole other side of this I haven't touched yet. And it's a side that, frankly, a lot of you probably already have some opinion about, because it's the most recent and the most contested and the one that's still actively being written. What happens when, after thousands of years of being the thing in the dark, Lilith gets picked up again by people who read her oldest story, the one about the equal creation and the simple refusal, and decide that maybe, just maybe, she was the only character in the whole garden who was paying attention. But before we get there, and we will, I promise, that's where tonight ends. I want to spend some time in the Middle Centuries, the long middle, because if the early texts gave Lilith her shape and the modern Reclamation gives her a new meaning, then it's the long stretch in between, roughly 1,000 years, give or take, depending on where you draw the lines, where Lilith actually lived in people's daily lives. Not in scripture, not in academic argument, in bedrooms and birthing rooms, and the small folded papers tucked into the linings of cradles. This is where the story stops being about Lilith as a character and starts being about Lilith as a practice, something people did, rather than something people read. Take the amulets. I mentioned them earlier, the 3 names, but I didn't tell you what they actually look like. And I think it matters, because there's something almost touching about the specificity of these objects. They weren't elaborate. A piece of parchment, sometimes paper later on, folded into a small packet, the 3 angelic names, written in a particular order, sometimes accompanied by additional verses, protective psalms, names of God, sometimes simple geometric symbols whose meaning had been lost even to the people drawing them, passed down as, this is how it's done, long after anyone remembered why. These were hung above doorways, tucked under pillows, sewn into the swaddling of newborns. In some communities, a piece of red string, red specifically, the color matters, though exactly why depends on which folk tradition you're asking, would be tied around a crib, sometimes with small bells attached. The idea being that Lilith, or whatever local variant of her, had been absorbed into the regional imagination, would be deterred by sound, by motion, by the simple fact of a barrier existing, even a flimsy one. I keep coming back to the flimsiness. A piece of string, a folded paper, 3 names, against what exactly? A being who spoke the unspeakable name of God and rose from the earth under her own power. It doesn't add up on paper. And yet, for 1,000 years, in dozens of languages, across an enormous geographic range, this is what people did. And as far as the historical record can tell us, it seemed to work. Children were protected. Nights passed without incident. The string held. Maybe that's the whole point though. Maybe the string was never really holding back Lilith. Maybe the string was holding together the people doing the tying, giving shaking hands something to do, giving an exhausted new parent in the middle of the night a ritual, a sequence of actions, a feeling of having done everything that could be done. I said something like this earlier, and I'm aware I'm repeating myself, but I think it bears repeating because it's the through line of this entire middle period. Lilith, in these centuries, wasn't primarily a theological problem. She was a practical one, a problem you solved with your hands in the dark while someone small slept nearby. There's a particular night, and I want to describe this not as history exactly, because I can't point you to a single specific event, but as a kind of composite, sort of scene that probably happened in some form, thousands of times across hundreds of years, in homes from Baghdad to Krakow, to villages whose names never made it into any text at all, where a mother, alone, the rest of the household asleep, sits up because the baby has stopped breathing for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of moment that happens, that's normal, that means nothing. Except that in the dark, at 3 a.m, with everyone else asleep, nothing means nothing. Everything means something. And so she reaches, without quite deciding to, for the small folded paper tucked into the edge of the cradle, and she presses it flat against the child's chest, just for a second, and the baby breathes again, because babies do that. They pause, and then they breathe, and she doesn't know, will never know, whether the paper did anything at all, but she keeps it there. Of course she does. I don't know why I find that scene more affecting than almost anything else in this whole sprawling mythology. More than the Red Sea, more than the Serpent, more than any of the cosmic scale stuff about fractures in divinity. Maybe because it's the one part of the story where Lilith isn't doing anything. She's just present, as an absence, as a fear, as the reason the paper is there at all. The most powerful she ever is, in this version, is the size of the space underneath a folded piece of parchment. There's one more thread I want to pull on before we widen out geographically, because it connects back to something I said much earlier and I think deserves more room than I initially gave it. The 100 children dying every day, the ones Lilith chose not to save when she refused to return. What happened to them in the stories? Not biologically. Obviously, they're not biological in any sense the word usually carries, but narratively. Where do they go in the larger architecture of this mythology? Some traditions don't address this at all, and the silence itself is worth noting. The number is given, 100 a day, and then the story moves on, as though the number was simply a measure of the stakes, a way of communicating how serious the angels' threat was, rather than a population of beings whose fate we're meant to follow. They're rhetorical children, in a sense, present in the story to establish the cost of Lilith's choice, and then gone from the narrative entirely. The way a number in a news report can represent an enormous amount of suffering, while the report itself moves on to the next sentence. But other traditions do follow them, or follow something like them, and what they become is, I think, one of the stranger corners of this entire mythology. In some folk material, the children who die in this way don't simply cease to exist. They become a specific category of spirit, restless, neither fully demon nor fully anything else, said to wander in places associated with loss. Crossroads again, like the figures I'll mention in a moment when we get to the Balkans, but also, and this is the detail that stayed with me, places where water meets land, riverbanks, the edges of seas, Lilith's own point of departure, the Red Sea, recurring in miniature, over and over, in the fates of the children she didn't save. I don't know what to make of that pattern, the recurrence of water edges throughout this mythology. The Red Sea where Lilith fled, the watery boundaries where her lost children are said to wander, even if you go back to the very oldest layer. The night spirit's association with storms, which in a lot of ancient Near Eastern thought were themselves understood as a kind of conflict between the ordered land and the chaotic sea. Water keeps showing up at the edges of this story, at every threshold, every departure, every loss. Maybe that's just because water is, in almost every mythology everywhere, the default symbol for the boundary between the known and the unknown. It's not a Lilith-specific pattern. It's just what water does, symbolically, across an enormous range of unrelated traditions. And I'm probably reading more into the recurrence here than the recurrence actually supports. But I keep noticing it anyway, so I'm mentioning it. Make of it what you will. There's a specific custom, and I want to flag, again, that the documentation for this is thin, scattered across folklore collections from different periods and regions. The kind of material that's hard to verify and easy to overstate, in which families in certain communities would leave small offerings near water on specific nights of the year. Bread, sometimes, or small lit candles set adrift. The kind of practice that exists in dozens of unrelated traditions for dozens of unrelated reasons, but which, in at least some of the accounts I've come across, was specifically described as being for the lost ones, not named as Lilith's children explicitly in most versions, but understood by the people doing it to be connected to her story somehow, even if nobody could quite articulate the connection in words. I find this almost unbearably moving, and I'm aware that I keep saying things are moving tonight, more than I usually do. But there's something about a tradition of leaving bread by a river for children who are never born in any sense most of us would recognize, lost in a mythological event that may never have happened in any historical sense at all. And yet the bread gets left anyway, generation after generation, for beings whose entire existence is technically just a number in an old story, 100 a day. That's all they ever were in the text, a number attached to a threat, attached to a refusal. And yet someone, somewhere, for a very long time, thought they deserved bread. I don't think that's really about Lilith in the end. I think it might be about something underneath Lilith, something the story of Lilith gave people a way to access, even if the story itself isn't really about it in any direct sense. Grief for children who die before they're named, before they're fully arrived, before the world has had a chance to do right by them. That grief exists independent of any mythology. It's one of the oldest griefs there is. And maybe what Lilith's story did for the communities that told it and ritualized it for 1,000 years wasn't so much explain that grief as give it a place to go, a name to attach to it, a river to leave bread beside. They travel the way these things do, picked up by neighboring cultures, sometimes directly, sometimes through trade routes and shared cities. And the simple fact that people who live near each other tell each other stories, whether or not they share a religion. In parts of the Balkans and Greece, there's a figure, sometimes called by names that are clearly cognate with Lilith, sometimes called something else entirely, a local name that absorbed the same fears without necessarily absorbing the same name, who haunts crossroads and cemeteries, who appears to travelers at night in the form of a beautiful woman, and who is, depending on the telling, either a vampire, a demon, or simply a restless spirit with no clear theological category at all. Just a thing that's out there, that you don't want to meet, that your grandmother warned you about, without ever quite explaining what it was. In German-speaking regions, there's overlap. And again, I want to be careful here, because overlap doesn't mean the same. With figures associated with the wild hunt, processions of spirits that ride through the sky on certain nights of the year, led by a female figure who, in some tellings, bears Lilith's name directly, and in other tellings bears a name that scholars have argued about for a very long time without reaching consensus. A name that might be related, might be a coincidence, might be one of those places where two independent traditions arrived at similar shapes for similar reasons, and the resemblance is just resemblance, not descent, not the same root, just two trees that happen to have grown into similar silhouettes. I find myself wanting to tie all of this together into one neat lineage, one continuous thread from ancient Mesopotamia all the way through to, say, a German folk tale recorded in the 19th century. And I can't, honestly, not with any intellectual honesty. The truth is messier. Some of these connections are real, documented, traceable through specific texts that we can point to and say, this one borrowed from that one. Others are parallel, independent. The kind of thing that happens when human beings, regardless of where they live or what gods they worship, are afraid of the same basic things: the dark, the unprotected infant, the stranger at the threshold, the woman who doesn't behave the way she's supposed to. So there, let me try a different approach for a moment, because I think the cultural sprawl is starting to lose its shape, and I want to ground it again in something more concrete. Specific episodes, specific named encounters, the kind of thing that, in the Greek mythology I told you about a while back, would be a hero's individual labor or trial. Lilith doesn't have labors in that sense. She's not a hero, structurally, not in most versions. But there are specific stories, specific named encounters between her and particular figures that get told and retold, almost like episodes in a longer saga. One of these involves a figure named, and the spelling varies depending on the source, Ben-Sira, a legendary sage to whom an enormous body of folk wisdom and storytelling got attributed over the centuries. The way certain names become magnets for stories, regardless of whether the original person ever told them. In one version of this tale, Ben-Sira is asked by a king to heal the king's son, who is ill, and the cause of the illness is identified as Lilith, who has been afflicting the child in the night. Ben-Sira, in this story, doesn't fight her, doesn't banish her with violence. He negotiates. He invokes the names of the three angels, the same ones from the Red Sea bargain. And Lilith, in this telling, actually appears and explains herself, tells her own story. The garden, the refusal, the flight, the children dying by the hundreds. This is, as far as I'm aware, one of the only places in the entire body of traditional literature where Lilith gets to narrate her own history in her own words to another character within the story, rather than being narrated about the way she is everywhere else, including, I suppose, in this very episode you're listening to right now, which is its own kind of irony I probably shouldn't dwell on too long. In this telling, having explained herself, Lilith agrees again to the same bargain. The three names protect the child. She withdraws. The story ends more or less the way the Red Sea story ended, not with triumph, not with banishment, but with a negotiated boundary, a line drawn again that she agrees again not to cross. I keep noticing how often that happens, how often Lilith's stories end not with victory or defeat, but with a boundary being redrawn slightly, and both sides stepping back from it. It's almost administrative, in a way that I find weirdly moving, given how cosmic everything else about her is supposed to be. The first wife of Adam, the queen of demons, the possible serpent in the garden, and so much of her actual narrative function across all these centuries comes down to, where is the line, and will she stay on her side of it? There's another tradition, and this one I find harder to place, harder to date, the kind of story that seems to exist in multiple variants without any of them feeling like the original, involving Lilith and Solomon. Solomon, in a huge body of post-biblical legend, becomes a kind of master of demons generally. There's an entire genre of stories about him commanding spirits, binding them, using them for various tasks, sealing them into bottles or beneath seas, the sort of figure who shows up in story after story as the person who finally gets the upper hand on the supernatural, at least temporarily. In some of these stories, Lilith is among the spirits Solomon deals with, sometimes bound by him, sometimes negotiating with him the way she negotiated with Ben Sira. Sometimes, and this version always struck me as strange, appearing to him not as an enemy at all, but almost as a kind of consultant, someone with deep knowledge of the demonic hierarchy who Solomon questions in order to learn how to deal with other, lesser spirits. If that's true, even in just one version, even as a minor variant, it's a remarkable shift. The Queen of Demons, called in not as the threat, but as the expert, the one who knows how the rest of them work, because she's, in some sense, the one who made most of them. I don't have a tidy conclusion to draw from that. I just think it's worth sitting with for a second. Across all these centuries, all these cultures, all these competing versions of who and what Lilith is, there's this persistent thread of her as someone with knowledge, the serpent offering knowledge in the garden, the expert consulted by Solomon, the figure who, when finally given the chance to speak for herself in the Ben Sira story, doesn't rage or threaten, she explains. She has a story, and she tells it, and the story makes a kind of sense, even to the person she's telling it to. Knowledge, again. Always knowledge. I said earlier that if the serpent is Lilith, then what she offers, twice, across two scenes, is the capacity to want something other than what you've been told to want. And I think that's still true, but I want to add to it now. She's also, across all these later stories, the one who knows things, who has information nobody else has, who can explain the system because she's part of how the system was built, even if, especially if, the system was built, in part, by excluding her. there's a kind of bitter symmetry in that too. The figure who was cast out for asking a question becomes, centuries later, the figure other people have to come to when they have questions of their own. I want to mention one more thing before we move into the modern period, because it's the kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into either the ancient demon narrative or the modern feminist icon narrative. And I think that's exactly why it's interesting. In certain later mystical and magical traditions, and I'm being deliberately vague about exactly which ones, because of the sourcing here gets genuinely murky, the kind of murky where I'd rather underclaim than overclaim. Lilith isn't described as singular at all. There isn't one Lilith. There are, in some of these texts, multiple Liliths, a whole class of beings who share the name, the way siren or nymph describes a category rather than one individual in Greek storytelling. If that's right, then everything I've told you tonight, the garden, the Red Sea, Ben Sira, Solomon, might not even be about the same figure, might be about different members of a category, whose stories got flattened together over time into a single biography, because that's what storytelling does with categories. It takes a type and turns it into an individual, because individuals are easier to tell stories about than types. I don't know if that's true. I genuinely don't. But I find I can't quite let go of it, because it would explain so much of the inconsistency, the wildly different descriptions, the contradictory genealogies, the way she's sometimes a single demon and sometimes effectively a force of nature. Maybe the inconsistency isn't a flaw in the storytelling. Maybe it's the most accurate thing about her, a name that was always, from the very beginning, bigger than any one story could hold. Okay, I think it's time to talk about what Lilith became once people stopped being afraid of her, or at least once some people did, and started instead asking a very different question about that very first scene in the garden. Let me set the scene differently this time, because the texture of this part of the story is so different from everything before it. We're not in a garden anymore, or beside a sea, or in a birthing room with a folded paper. We're in lecture halls, reading groups, small printed magazines, the kind that got photocopied and passed hand to hand before anyone called anything going viral. We're in the second half of the 20th century, mostly, though the seeds go back further than that. And I want to acknowledge that, because nothing in this story ever has a clean starting point, and it would be dishonest to pretend this part does either. Here's the shift in its simplest form. For thousands of years, the dominant reading of Lilith's story went something like this. A being was created equal, refused to accept a subordinate role, and as a direct consequence of that refusal, became something monstrous, lost her place, lost her children, became the thing that haunts the dark. The moral in most tellings was implicit but unmistakable. This is what happens when you don't accept your place. And then, somewhere in the latter half of the 20th century, though again, the threads go back further, people started reading that same sequence of events and asking, wait, what if the moral isn't about Lilith at all? What if the moral is about the story itself, about a narrative tradition that could only imagine a refusal to be subordinate as something that leads inevitably to monstrousness? What if the becoming a demon part isn't a punishment that makes sense within the story's own logic, but is, instead, exactly what you'd expect a story told from a particular perspective to do with a character who refuses that perspective's basic premise? In other words, what if Lilith was never the villain of her own story? What if she's the villain of someone else's story, Adam's story, or the story of whoever first wrote down and the man should be on top, as though it was simply how things are? And what looks from inside that story like demonic corruption looks, from outside it like the only character who said no? I remember, and this is me, the narrator, stepping in for a second, because I think it's relevant. I remember the first time I encountered this reading. It wasn't in an academic context. It was in a poem, actually. One of those poems that gets passed around without anyone quite remembering where they first read it. And the poem didn't argue for this reading exactly. It just assumed it, wrote from inside Lilith's perspective, as though that perspective was simply obvious, simply the natural place to stand. And it took me, it took me embarrassingly long to realize how strange that was, how different from every other version of this story I'd encountered, and how, once I'd read it that way, I couldn't quite read it the other way again. Not fully. Something had shifted, and it didn't shift back. I think a lot of people who encountered this reclamation had some version of that experience, a switch that flips and doesn't flip back. Not because the old reading becomes impossible, exactly, but because it stops being the only reading, the default one, the one you don't even notice you're using. Once you've seen the garden from Lilith's side of it, once, you can't quite unsee it. The two readings sit next to each other. Afterward, the way two transparencies sit on top of each other on a projector, both visible at once, neither one cancelling the other out. This reclamation took a lot of forms, and I want to go through several of them, because they're not all the same, even though they get lumped together sometimes under a single banner. There's the literary form, poems, short stories, novels, retellings that take the bones of the old story and rebuild it from the inside, giving Lilith a voice, an interiority, a perspective the ancient texts never bothered to provide. In some of these retellings, the garden itself gets reimagined, not as a paradise that Lilith ruined or fled, but as something closer to a beautiful prison, a space designed around one inhabitant's comfort at the expense of another's. And Lilith's departure becomes not a fall, but an escape. The demons she gives birth to in some of these versions aren't monsters at all. They're simply what gets called demonic by a tradition that has no other category for the children of a woman who left. There's also a more explicitly spiritual or religious form of reclamation. People, often women, within or adjacent to Jewish tradition specifically, who've looked at Lilith not as someone to be exorcised from the tradition, but as someone to be brought back into it deliberately, as a figure who represents something the tradition needs and has been missing. I've read, and I want to be careful here, because this is a live, ongoing conversation within actual living religious communities, not just a literary trend, and I don't want to flatten it. I've read about ceremonies, modern ones, created in the last several decades, that explicitly invoke Lilith as part of rituals around things like miscarriage or difficult childbirth, or simply the experience of female anger that more traditional liturgy doesn't have much room for. The idea, as I understand it, isn't that Lilith was secretly good all along and everyone else was wrong. It's something more like Lilith represents an experience, exile, anger, the grief of being pushed out of a story that was supposed to include you, and that experience is real and human and deserves a name within the tradition, even if that name has historically been treated as something to ward off rather than something to hold. There's a kind of generosity in that, I think, toward both Lilith and toward the tradition that produced her. It doesn't throw out 3,000 years of texts. It just asks them to make a little more room. Then there's the broader cultural form, the one most people probably encounter first, honestly, even if they don't know its history. Lilith as a kind of shorthand in popular culture for female independence, female danger, female refusal, sometimes used thoughtfully, sometimes used as not much more than a cool-sounding name for a character who's supposed to seem edgy or dangerous, with little to no awareness of where the name comes from or what it carried for most of its history. I won't pretend every modern use of the name Lilith is doing the careful, considered reclamation work I just described. A lot of it isn't. A lot of it is surface, a name borrowed because it sounds ancient and a little bit forbidden, attached to a character because Lilith reads to a contemporary ear as instantly evocative of something dark and powerful and feminine, without much further thought given to it. And here's where I have to admit something, and I've gone back and forth about whether to say this, but I think it's honest, so I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing either. Even the surface level uses, the ones that don't engage with 3,000 years of theology and folk magic, even those keep the name circulating, keep it available, keep it in the cultural water supply, so to speak, so that when someone does encounter the deeper version, the garden, the equality, the refusal, the centuries of amulets and birthing room fears, the name isn't completely unfamiliar. There's already a hook for it to catch on. I don't know. Maybe that's too generous. Maybe it's just what happens to every old story eventually. It gets used for things its original tellers never imagined, and some of those uses are thoughtful, and some of them are just names, picked because they sound good, attached to whatever needed a name that day. Let me try to pull back to something a little more concrete though, because I'm aware this section has gotten somewhat abstract, a lot of some say and in certain readings, without much of the texture that the earlier parts of tonight's story had. And I think that's actually accurate to the material, in a way. The modern reclamation of Lilith doesn't have the kind of crisp, memorable scenes that the ancient story does. There's no Red Sea moment, no three angels with their slightly ridiculous, almost identical names. It's diffuse. It's a shift in how a story gets read, distributed across thousands of individual readers and writers and ritual makers, each of them arriving at some version of, wait, what if she was right, more or less independently, or in conversation with a few other people who'd had the same thought, and the whole thing adding up over decades to into something that doesn't have a single origin point the way the ancient story, for all its contradictions, at least has a single garden. I think that's actually fitting. In a way I keep wanting to call ironic, but maybe fitting is the better word. The ancient Lilith is defined by absence. She's built, as I said much earlier, out of the gaps in an older story. A single word in a single prophetic list, expanded over centuries into an entire biography. And the modern Lilith is also, in a sense, built out of absence, out of the gap between what the old story says happened to her and what a reader today feels should have happened, given what they now believe about equality, about autonomy, about what it means for two people made from the same earth to be made also the same. Absence calling to absence across 3,000 years. I keep wanting a better way to put that, and I don't think I have one. So there, I want to spend a little time now on something that I think of, and this is my framing, not something I'm pulling from a specific source, as the battle over Lilith, because in a story that's been organized all night around conflicts, Lilith against Adam, Lilith against the angels, the old reading against the new one, it would feel strange not to acknowledge that this last conflict, the one happening right now, in the present tense, is itself a kind of war, even if it's fought with essays and rituals and casting choices rather than swords. On one side, traditions still very much alive, in which Lilith remains what she's been for most of recorded history, a danger, a name you protect children from, a figure whose proper place in the story is the threshold, the outside, the dark beyond the firelight. These traditions aren't relics. They're practiced today by real people for whom the amulets and the warding rituals aren't folklore as curiosity, but folklore as faith, part of a living religious practice that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not just as raw material for someone else's reinterpretation. On the other side, the reclamation I've been describing, Lilith as the first to refuse, the first to leave, the only one in the garden who asked the right question, even if she asked it about something as small seeming as who lies on top of whom. And I want to be really clear about this. I don't think these two sides are simply right and wrong, old and new, regressive and progressive, any of those easy binaries. I think they're both responses to the same unbearable gap in the original material, the gap where Lilith's own voice should be and isn't. One response fills that gap with fear. We don't know what she'd say, so we protect against whatever it might be. The other response fills the same gap with identification. We don't know what she'd say, so we imagine she'd say what we would say in her position. Both of those are acts of imagination. Neither of them is what Lilith actually thinks, because, and this is maybe the most important thing I can say about her, the thing that ties together the demon queen and the feminist icon, and the figure dissolved into a category, and the small folded paper under the cradle. Lilith doesn't get to think anything in any of these texts. Not really, not in her own words, except for that one Ben Sira story. And even there, she's speaking within someone else's narration, someone else's frame, someone else's decision about what she's allowed to say and for how long before the story moves on to its actual point, which was never really about her. It was about the king's son and whether he'd get better. She is, across every single version of this story, in every century, in every culture that's ever picked her up, spoken about, almost never spoken to, and certainly never simply allowed to speak, unprompted at length on her own terms, the way, and here's the comparison I keep coming back to, even though I'm not sure it's fair, the way Adam gets to in the original garden. He names the animals. He explains his side of the dispute to God directly, and God listens, and God acts on what Adam says. Lilith speaks one word, the name, and then she's gone. And everything else we know about her comes from people describing her, warding her off, negotiating with her, writing rituals about her, writing poems for her. Even tonight, even this. I'm aware of that, and I don't think I can resolve it. And I'm not sure resolving it is the point. I think the point, if there is one, and maybe there isn't, maybe that's also part of the lesson here, is that some absences don't get filled. They just get inhabited differently by each generation that comes along and needs somewhere to put whatever it's currently afraid of or whatever it's currently hoping for. Let me pause here. Actually, properly pause, the way I sometimes do partway through these, because I realize we're roughly at the middle of tonight's story, and there's a real shift coming in. What we talk about next. Everything so far has been about Lilith herself, her origins, her transformations, how she's been read and misread and reread across thousands of years. What I want to do in the second half is widen out even further and look at the larger structures she sits inside, the demonic hierarchies that grew up around her, the specific figures who populate those hierarchies, the way later traditions imagined an entire infernal cosmos with Lilith at or near its center, and how all of that eventually collides with and gets absorbed by and partially survives and partially doesn't the same historical forces that hollowed out so much of the older mythological world, empire, new religions, the slow fade of belief into literature that I described a while back now when we were talking about a completely different pantheon. So, let's keep going. I mentioned a while back that some of the later mystical traditions describe an entire infernal hierarchy, a court with Lilith somewhere near or at its head, and a consort, and an org chart's worth of subordinate figures, princes and ministers and functionaries of darkness. I called it an org chart, half jokingly, and I want to take that joke a little more seriously now, because I think there's something genuinely revealing in just how administrative this hierarchy gets the further into it you go. There's a figure in some of these texts described as a kind of gatekeeper of one of the lower regions. Not a ruler exactly, more like someone who processes arrivals, the way a customs official processes travelers, except the travelers in this case are souls, and the destination is one of several distinct zones, each with its own character, its own, I want to say, climate, even though that's clearly not the right word for a place with no weather, but it's the closest word I have. One zone is described as a place of fire, another, confusingly, as a place of ice, and I remember being surprised by that the first time I read it, because I think most people, raised on a certain set of cultural assumptions, expect the underworld to be uniformly hot, and it's strange, almost unsettling in a small way, to encounter a tradition where part of it is cold instead, where the punishment isn't burning but freezing, isn't too much sensation but too little. There's another figure, and this one I find oddly endearing, which feels like a strange thing to say about a demon, who's associated specifically with sloth. Not malice, not cruelty, not any of the more dramatic vices you'd expect from a figure in an infernal court. Sloth, the demon of not getting around to things, of putting things off, of meaning to do something and then not. I don't know what it says about a mythology that it has room for a demon like that. A demon whose entire domain is procrastination, sitting in the same hierarchy as figures associated with war and plague and the death of infants. Maybe it says that the people building this hierarchy understood something true, that the small failures, the daily ones, the ones that don't feel like sins because they're so ordinary, are part of the same continuum as the big ones. Or maybe it's just funny, a little, in a way that wasn't intended to be funny and survived anyway, the way jokes sometimes survive inside very serious documents by accident. Anyway, back to Lilith specifically, because I don't want to lose her in the org chart, even though I think the org chart itself is part of the point. The point being that by the time these later traditions were fully assembled, Lilith wasn't a lone figure haunting a single garden anymore. She was the head of an entire administrative structure with departments, so to speak, each handling a different category of human suffering, each with its own named functionary, its own specific domain. And Lilith at the top, less like a monster in the older sense, and more like, and here's where I'm going to attempt a comparison I'm not sure is going to land, so bear with me. More like the founder of a company who's drifted, over the years, from doing the actual work to simply being the name on the building, the thing everyone below her answers to, even if, by this point, she's barely involved in the day-to-day operations of any specific torment. I see what I was going for with that. I'm not sure it gets there, but I've left it in because I think there's something true buried in it, even if the shape of the comparison is a little off. Something about how power, even infernal power, even mythological power, tends to become less personal and more structural the longer it exists. The Lilith of the garden is intensely personal, a specific being with a specific grievance, making a specific choice. The Lilith of the fully developed infernal hierarchy is something closer to an institution, a title more than a person. The garden story happened to someone. The hierarchy is something that exists, the way a government exists, regardless of who's currently occupying which office. I think that shift from person to institution might be the most universal thing about her entire story, honestly. It's what happens to a lot of figures over enough centuries. They start as someone something happened to, and they end as a category other things get filed under. There's a specific thread I want to follow now, because it connects this hierarchy back to something I touched on earlier and didn't fully develop. The idea from certain later texts that Lilith might not refer to a single being at all, but to a class. If that's right, then the hierarchy I've just described might not be Lilith's court in the sense of belonging to one individual. It might be more like a guild or a lineage, multiple beings across multiple eras, all carrying forward the same name, the same role, the same basic function, The way certain titles get passed down through royal houses regardless of which specific person currently holds them. Some later folklore, and here the sourcing gets thinner, more scattered, the kind of material that exists mostly in scattered references rather than any single coherent text, describes something like this explicitly. Of first Lilith, the original figure from the garden, and then successive Liliths, each one stepping into the role after the previous one fades or is somehow superseded, the position itself outlasting any individual who holds it. I find this idea both unsettling and, in a strange way, comforting. Unsettling because it means the original Lilith, the one with the actual grievance, the actual refusal, the actual children dying by the hundred, might not even be the Lilith most later stories are about. The name might have outlived her specifically, the way a throne outlives a king, but comforting too, because it means her story isn't trapped, frozen forever in that one moment at the Red Sea. It moved on. Other beings, other women, in whatever sense women applies to beings made of fire or smoke or whatever these later texts imagine demons to be made of, inherited the name, and presumably inherited some version of the choice that came with it: stay or refuse, submit or leave. I keep returning to that choice. I think it might be the actual center of this entire mythology, more than any specific event. Not the garden, not the Red Sea, not the serpent, but the choice itself, repeating generation after generation every time someone, something, finds themselves in the position Lilith was in at the very beginning, equal, asked to be less than equal, and having to decide in that moment what happens next. Let me shift gears now, because I've been circling around abstractions for a while, and I want to bring this back to something more grounded, the way the broader mythological world that Lilith belongs to eventually intersected with history in the same way I described weeks ago now, with an entirely different pantheon. Empires rise, religions spread, old beliefs don't disappear so much as they get absorbed, repurposed, or pushed into the margins where they survive, sometimes for an extraordinarily long time, as folk practice long after they've stopped being anyone's official theology. For Lilith, this process looks a little different than it did for, say, the Greek gods, because Lilith was never the official theology of anything, not really. She was always already a marginal figure, an absence filled in by commentary, a folk belief running alongside the official texts rather than constituting them. So the fading that happened to figures like Zeus or Athena, temples closing, statues weathering, festivals abolished by imperial decree, doesn't really have an equivalent for Lilith, because there were never temples to close. There was never an Olympic Games-style public festival in her honor that some emperor could ban. What happened to her instead was quieter and in some ways stranger, as the communities that maintained the folk practices around her, the amulets, the protective rituals, the birthing room customs, modernized, urbanized, moved away from the villages and extended families where these practices had been transmitted, person to person, generation to generation. The practices themselves became rarer, not banned, not denounced particularly, though some modernizing religious movements within the relevant traditions did push back against what they saw as superstition, folk accretions that had nothing to do with real religious practice, just less common, quieter, the kind of thing your grandmother did, that your mother maybe still did sometimes, a little embarrassed about it, and that you, by the time you're old enough to have your own children, have mostly only heard about as a story rather than something you'd actually do. This is, I think, its own kind of fading, not the dramatic kind, not temples crumbling and ivy creeping over altars, but the quieter kind, the kind where a practice doesn't get destroyed so much as it gets outgrown, maybe, by people who still love the people who taught it to them, but who live in apartments now, in cities, with electric lights that make the specific darkness the old rituals were designed for largely obsolete. What do you ward off with a folded paper and 3 angelic names in a room that's never actually dark because there's a street light outside the window and a night light in the corner and a baby monitor with its own small glowing screen? I don't think this is a sad story, particularly, or it's sad the way a lot of things about modernization are sad, which is to say, genuinely sad, but also bound up with things that are clearly, unambiguously good. Fewer infants dying in the night, for reasons that have everything to do with medicine and sanitation and nothing to do with amulets, obviously. That's good. Full stop. No qualification needed. But it does mean that the specific cultural context that gave Lilith her most intimate, most domestic role, the thing in the dark that the paper protects against, has largely dissolved. For most people, most places, the fear that animated those rituals for 1,000 years has been, to a significant extent, addressed by other means, and a figure who exists primarily as the answer to a fear doesn't have much of a job left when the fear itself recedes. Except, and here's where I think the modern reclamation I described earlier becomes not just a separate parallel development, but almost a kind of rescue. Because right around the time the old fear-based role was fading, for the reasons I just described, urbanization, modern medicine, the simple dissolution of the village-scale social structures that transmitted these practices, a new role was opening up. Not the thing that threatens infants in the dark, but the figure who first said no. And that role doesn't depend on dark rooms or folded papers or any of the specific material conditions of the older folk practice. It depends only on the existence of the original story, the garden, the equality, the refusal, which, because it had been written down, preserved in texts, commented on by centuries of scholars, even when the folk practices around it were fading, was still there, still available, waiting, you could almost say, though that's probably too generous a way to put it, for someone to read it differently. I find that timing remarkable, honestly. Not because I think there's anything mystical about it, some grand design where one role fades exactly so another can take its place. Nothing that tidy, but just because it's a genuinely unusual thing for an ancient figure to do, to have one entire function become largely obsolete, and then, instead of fading into pure historical curiosity the way so many old folk beliefs do, to pick up an entirely new function, a function that nobody in the original tradition could have anticipated, using the exact same source material that had always been there, just read differently. The garden didn't change. The Red Sea didn't change. What changed was which parts of the story people decided were the point. I want to say something here about the consort figure again, the one I mentioned earlier, paired with Lilith in some of the later traditions, because there's a coda to that part of the story that I think is worth including, even though it's a relatively minor thread. In some later folkloric and literary treatments, this pairing gets reimagined too, not as a hierarchy, not as ruler and consort in the sense of one having authority over the other, but as something closer to two exiles who found each other. Two figures pushed to the margins by the same broader cosmology for different reasons, who end up not ruling anything, particularly in these versions, but simply existing together outside the structures that excluded them both. I don't want to overstate how common this version is. It's not the dominant reading, even within the modern Reclamation material, and a lot of the Reclamation tradition doesn't engage with the consort figure much at all, focusing instead on Lilith as a singular figure defined by her own choices rather than by a relationship. But I include it because, and this is, I think, the closest thing to an anachronistic flinch I'm going to have tonight, so I want to flag it as it happens. There's something in this version that brushes up against a much more contemporary idea, the idea of finding community among people who've all been excluded by the same system for different reasons, who recognize something of their own exclusion in each other's. I don't think the people who first developed this version of the consort relationship were thinking in those terms. That framing belongs to a much later set of conversations that hadn't happened yet. But the shape of the story brushes against it anyway, the way an old building sometimes turns out, almost by accident, to have a room shaped exactly like a room someone needed centuries later for a purpose nobody who built the building could have imagined. I'll leave that there. I don't think it needs more than that. Let me collect myself for a second. I've been going for a while now, and I want to make sure I land the last part of tonight properly, because there's a kind of ending I want to get to. And endings with this particular figure are tricky, for reasons I think will become obvious as we get closer to it. What I want to do for the rest of tonight is bring together everything we've covered: the garden, the Red Sea, the Demon Queen, the folk traditions, the modern reclamation, the hierarchy, the fading and the rescue, and ask what all of it adds up to. Not in the sense of a single tidy answer, because I don't think this story has one, and I'd be doing it a disservice to pretend otherwise, but in the sense of what is Lilith now, today, to the people who still tell her story, in whatever form they tell it. What work is she still doing in the world 3,000 or 4,000 years after a single word in a single prophetic list first attached itself to a name that meant night? That's where we're headed. Stay with me. So here's where I land, for whatever it's worth. And I want to say up front that where I land is going to be more tentative than how I usually end these, because this isn't a story with a death or a fall of a city or a final battle that settles things one way or the other. There's no smoke drifting out to sea here. There's no funeral pyre. Lilith doesn't die, doesn't get redeemed in any final official sense, doesn't get cast permanently into a pit with a lid sealed over it. She's just still going, still being told, still picked up by whoever needs her next, for whatever they need her for. I think that might be the thing that sets her apart from almost every other figure we've spent time with across all these episodes. The Greek gods, when their story ended, and it did end in the sense that the temples closed and the festivals stopped and the active worship faded into literature, left behind a fairly stable set of stories. Heracles did his 12 labors. That's fixed now. Nobody's adding a 13th. The story became, in a real sense, finished, even as its meaning kept getting reinterpreted by each new era. Lilith's story isn't finished. It's not even close to finished. New chapters keep getting added, not to her ancient biography, which is fixed in the old text the way Heracles' labors are fixed, but to what the whole thing means, which keeps shifting, generation by generation, in ways that the ancient texts could never have anticipated, and that the medieval mystics couldn't have anticipated either. And I think this is worth sitting with. Whatever gets written about her next, decades from now, by people who haven't been born yet, will probably also be something none of us listening tonight could fully anticipate. That's strange when you think about it. Most myths are things that happened, in whatever sense myths happen, events in a fixed past that get reinterpreted but not added to. Lilith's myth is still happening. The garden happened, sure, in whatever sense it happened. But the meaning of the garden, what it says, what it's for, who gets to claim it, that part is ongoing, present tense. Tonight, even, in a small way, because every time this story gets told again, by someone, to someone, in whatever form, it's one more iteration of the same basic process that's been running for 3,000 or 4,000 years. Someone looks at the gap where Lilith's voice should be and decides what goes in it. I keep thinking about that gap. I've used the word absence a few times tonight, maybe too many times, but I don't have a better word for it. So I'm going to use it once more, and then try to actually say something with it, rather than just naming it again. The absence at the center of Lilith's story isn't a flaw in the story. I want to be really careful about how I say this, because it would be easy to make this sound like I'm saying the absence is good, actually, a feature, not a bug. And I don't think that's quite right either. There's something genuinely sad about a figure who, across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, almost never gets to speak for herself. That sadness is real, and I don't want to paper over it with a neat observation about how productive the absence has been. But the absence is also, I think, why she's lasted. A figure who'd been given a full voice from the very beginning, a complete origin story, a clearly stated motivation, an ending that resolved everything, might have become exactly what I said the Greek heroes became. Fixed, finished. A story you could tell completely and then set down. Lilith's incompleteness, the single word in the prophetic list, the unexplained knowledge of the unspeakable name, the negotiated boundary that never quite becomes a resolution. That incompleteness is an opening. It's the reason every generation that's encountered her has felt like there was room to add something. Not because the earlier versions were wrong, exactly, but because they were never claiming to be complete in the first place. They were always, even the oldest ones, responses to a gap rather than descriptions of a whole. I don't know if that's a comforting thought or not. I've gone back and forth on it while putting tonight together. Part of me thinks it's one of the most hopeful things about this entire mythology. The idea that incompleteness isn't failure, that a story with room left in it is, in some sense, more alive than a story that's been sealed shut. But part of me also thinks about that mother I described earlier in the composite scene, sitting up at 3 a.m. with a folded paper in her hand. And I think about how her fear was real, whatever else the story around it became later. And I don't want the eventual literary afterlife of that fear, the poems and the rituals and the reclamation, to make it sound like the fear itself was somehow just raw material, waiting to be repurposed into something more palatable. It wasn't raw material. It was a person, afraid, in the dark, doing the only thing she knew how to do. Maybe both things can be true. The fear was real and mattered on its own terms, in its own moment. And also later, different people with different fears found something usable in the same name, the same story, and built something else out of it, something the original fear never anticipated and wouldn't necessarily have approved of. And that's fine. That's allowed. That's just what happens to stories that last long enough. They get used by people the original tellers never met, for purposes the original tellers never imagined, and the story doesn't get to vote on any of it. I think, and I'm aware this is close to where I started, the garden, the equal creation, the simple refusal. I think the most honest thing I can say about Lilith, after everything, is that she's a story about what happens when someone is asked a question they're not supposed to actually answer. Why should I lie beneath you when we were made the same way, from the same earth? That's not really a question in the garden. It's a formality. The expected answer is silence or acquiescence, or, at most, some explanation that restates the premise rather than defending it. Because that's how it's done. Because that's the natural order. Lilith answered it anyway. Not with violence. There's no violence in the original confrontation, whatever later. Hostile tellings would add to make her seem more dangerous than the bare scene actually shows. She answered it by leaving, by choosing the consequence, exile, the deaths of her own children, 3,000 or 4,000 years of being the thing in the dark, overstaying somewhere the question wasn't actually allowed to have an answer. I don't know what to call that. Heroic feels wrong, given everything that came after, the children, the centuries of fear, the amulets over cradles. Tragic feels closer, but also incomplete, because tragedy usually implies an ending, a fall, a moment where everything is lost, and Lilith's story doesn't end. It just keeps going, picking up new meanings the way a river picks up silt, becoming, by the time it reaches us, something the source water could never have predicted, while still, somehow, being made of the same water it always was. I think that's where I have to leave it. Not because I've run out of things to say. There's always more with a story like this. There could be another 4 episodes and we still wouldn't have covered everything. The variant traditions I didn't even mention tonight. The specific textual debates, the regional folk practices I only gestured at. But because I think the shape of the story itself is telling me something about how to end it. Not with a resolution, not with a final image of triumph or defeat. Just a pause. The kind of pause that happens at 3 in the morning when the breathing steadies again and the room is quiet, and whatever was or wasn't there a moment ago has, for now, gone still. The garden is closed now. Has been in the story for a very long time. The angels went back up. The amulets, in most homes, have been put away, or were never hung in the first place, or exist now mostly as objects in museums, behind glass, with small cards explaining what they were for to people who will never need to use one. But the question is still there. Why should one lie beneath the other when both were made the same way, from the same earth? Nobody's finished answering it. Thank you for listening tonight. As always, let me know where you are, what this sounded like in your room, whether any of it landed the way I hoped it would or didn't. There's more to come. There's always more to come. Good night.